Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome back to another Eternal news episode. So things are happening fast these days in Eternal. So just after another balance change and new cards added to Expedition twice, we now are seeing another balance change patch happening with changes aimed at Throne to prepare the Throne format for the upcoming next ECQ that will be in the Throne format. And there are some pretty big and interesting changes to shake up the format in this one, so we'll go over all of them and how they affect the game and what they mean. But before we do, you know the drill. Subscribe down below and turn on the notification icon for more in the future. And now let's talk balance changes. Alright, so first is a big one. Torch got changed. Yeah, I mean, that's something that a lot of people, including myself, didn't really think would ever happen, but it did, and I think it's very reasonable. The reason is not necessarily that Torch is like overpowered. It's certainly very good and one of the top cards in the game. Also supported by the fact that they mentioned here that it was like the most played non-power card, fire constantly overrepresented in the top decks in any combination. And then if you look at tri-faction decks, they are usually fire. They are Winchest, they are Yennev, they are Ixtun. There are not that many tri-faction decks that don't run fire, especially top tier decks or like the new Sulta deck. They're basically all fire based, or at least part fire, and Torch is a big part of that. So yeah, the thing with Torch basically is that it's very format defining and kind of, as they said, make things feel a lot the same even with changes happening over a long time. And I agree with that. Like, I have mentioned many times that I'm not the biggest fan of Throne anymore. The format is growing too big and too stale, and it's devolving into this kind of just play the best answers and the best threats, jam them all together, often in a 3-faction shell with lots of crests to make your things even more stable, and then you just kind of answer everything, drop value bombs till your opponent eventually falls over, and that's just not the most interesting and diverse gameplay and play pattern. So shaking these things up is definitely interesting and desirable, I think. However, the way they changed Torch is they made it from fast to slow, which is interesting. Basically turning it from lightning bolt into chain lightning in Magic terms. The thing is, however, that I feel like this might not change enough, arguably, since the card is still very efficient and mostly does what it did. It just, you just have to use it right away, and it mainly makes it weaker against combat tricks and weaker against charge units. Those are the two things that are affected by this. So now with your aggressive deck, you're much less likely to get blown out, because Torch was the prime thing that blows you out. And now in a lot of cases and against a lot of decks, especially if they have limited power available, you can just go for your combat trick on your small unit and don't risk having it blown up by a Torch and being 2 for 1 and basically losing the game. So that's pretty big. And then there are some chargers, but there are actually not a lot that I can think of right now. There's Champion of Fury, but yeah, this isn't much of a thing. Suikalis doesn't get affected by Torch anyway. Whirling Duo hasn't seen play in quite some time, so there are not a lot of charge units affected by this. It still affects some stuff like I don't know, the opponent putting a Sodi Spell Shaper on a 2 health unit that you before could Torch before they hit you once. Now you can't, so that sort of stuff matters. There are a couple of corner cases, but overall the card is still very good, and I think it's gonna see play almost as much as before. It's just not gonna be as impactful anymore. I don't think it will affect the play rate much at least in the decks that are fire. Maybe it will make will reduce the amount of actual decks choosing fire as one of their colors, and therefore reducing the play rate that way by just making fire a little less appealing than maybe considering alternative colors for some tri-faction decks, or even exploring like non-fire 2-faction options more. But if you're in fire, you're still gonna jam 4 torch basically no matter what, I think. A change that I would have probably liked more that is that would have changed the card more, that would have been an interesting option, is turning it into Lightning Strike in Magic terms. Basically making it cost 2, leaving it at fast speed, to basically sort of change the pillar of the format in the sense that killing something that has 3 or less health now costs 2 instead of 1, and then we have Char, which is the like go-to 1-card thing that can only kill stuff with 2 or less health, sort of shock lightning strike type of dichotomy that we have in Magic these days usually. And the other change that I would have made alongside this, potentially, at least considered, is make Torch be able to hit anything. Because Torch killing sites, especially like 3 health sites for 1 at fast speed, would just be too efficient. But once Torch costs 2, it seems much more reasonable, because other cards that cost 2 or 3 can target sites too. Like if you get your Static Bolt to 3, you can kill a 3 health site, and a lot of the sites that you can kill have 2 health these days anyways, or 4. Like the only one that I can think of that has 3 is what was it? Temple, probably. Since Garden only has 2 now, Tomb has 2, and then the other ones like Office, Peak, Sulta Arcanum all have 4, so they wouldn't die to Torch anyway. So yeah, I think that would have been an interesting alternative, making it cost 2, keeping it at fast, and letting it target anything. That also would help a bit with balancing some of the sites that can be a bit obnoxious. And I mean, it's still bad in a way to have to torch a site, because it's still a 1 for 2, because they get value out of the first card, so they still 2 for 1-ing you if you torch it. And at 2 and fast, you still have these situations where you have to play around it on your turn against their torch, but it's more of a cost for them to be able to do that. Like leaving 2 power open is a real commitment. 1 power is something that you often have left over. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Torch. Overall, I welcome the change to Torch. This is the less invasive change, I would say. I think the one that I just suggested would have been a bigger and more invasive change, but also an interesting one and worth considering. But this is also fine. It affects things less. It just makes Torch less of a universally good tool and a bit more limited, which is also fine. Any thing that shakes things up in Throne, I think, is pretty great right now. Next we have Auralian Merchant, another very good change. Talked with people on the team the other day, like which cards we dislike the most in Throne right now, and that's one that Finkel, for example, brought up, and a very good point that I didn't think of at the time off the top of my head. But yeah, I think the card should have become a 3 health unit long ago. It is the only merchant that both has a good stabilizing board impact and additional value. Like the only other merchant that we have right now is not even a merchant, it's a smuggler, so you have to be in 2 factions, and it's only just a measly 1/4 with Berserk that doesn't really do a whole lot. While Auralian Merchant has the critical 4 health as well, so it's a really good blocker, it doesn't die to Torch, and it is basically like virtual card advantage by ramping you as well. And that as a single faction merchant, which is just so much above the power level of all the other smugglers and merchants that are basically designed at this point and changed to be very weak units if they weren't merchants for 3. Like most of them basically are 2-drops that pay 1 extra power for the ability to go to the market. Except for our Lien merchant, which would be absurd as a 2-drop. I wouldn't have minded even if they would have given him his 1 attack back and make her 1/3. But that might still put her like too far above the other merchants and smugglers. The one thing that I dislike a bit about it being 0 attack, and I've said this before, is that it makes it a bit like black and white. Like if your deck is defensive, it's really good and still better than most other merchants and smugglers. But if your deck is proactive, it's really awkward and not really something you want to play if you don't have to, but you still kind of have to because it's still better than a lot of the other merchants and smugglers. But you're putting like this weirdly defensive slow unit in your proactive deck, which is another thing that further contributes to being in an awkward spot in this game if you are proactive, because a lot of cards are much better in sort of reactive or grindy decks. Like playing these 2/2 merchants and smugglers is a lot less of a problem when you play a lot of cheap removal and have like late game and have cards that catch you back up from behind than when you're trying to curve out and be aggressive. Like you can't really play like a 3-cost 2/2 on turn 3 in your aggro deck. That's just really, really bad, and also makes you play into their like turn 3 merchant or smuggler, because suddenly your 3-drop trades with theirs, where as an aggro deck you would want to play like a 4/4 or 5/5 on 3 that makes their merchants or smugglers awkward. Sure, sometimes you can do that and play your merchant or smuggler later, but you still have this really weak card that you wouldn't even play as a 2-drop if it didn't have the market option. Like if you take a lot of smugglers and merchants, make them 1 cheaper and remove the summon trigger of going to the market, none of them, or almost none of them, would make it into aggressive or proactive decks. Like the Huro one is one that would. The Rakano probably still wouldn't make it because 2/1 double damage for 2 is just too bad. And the other ones are even worse, like 2/2 Aegis. And like 2/2 Aegis maybe in very corner cases might be okay, but if you compare it to something like Crownwatch Paladin, it's pretty embarrassing. And Crownwatch Paladin is not quite the pinnacle of aggressive 2-drops these days anymore. It's still a very solid card and a card you at least consider playing if you are in a Justice aggressive deck. But a lot of the time you end up not even doing it because your deck doesn't support it well enough, because it gets outclassed so fast, or because you have so many better, more powerful 2-drop options with either other colors or just Injustice that doesn't make it, like Hoyan for example. So yeah, this is a pretty good change, especially with Torch being a little pulled back. It's slightly less rough, but there's also like other DL3 things like the Kairos choice, conflict rate, and so on. Although I doubt conflict rate will suddenly see play in Throne. But yeah, I think this is a very good change. Also opens up more proactive options, because turn 3 merchant usually just colds your board. Like a lot of these time decks just go like merchant into Titan or a big 5-drop, and then if you don't have a removal or a trick for merchant and for the big unit that follows, you're already like stalled out and your aggression is cold and the opponent takes over. Like that's a part of why aggressive decks struggle so much in Throne right now, and I think we need to get aggro back in the mix. And I mean back in the mix of top tier decks, not like, I mean there are lower tier aggro decks, people trying some stuff on ladder and playing it, it's like okay, but the last time that I actively considered an aggro deck enthroned to be really good, being top tier, possibly tier 1, and possibly good enough to play in a tournament has been a long time. And I think that's really problematic, because I think the macro archetypes all need to be, to some extent, top tier viable to keep each other in check and keep things balanced and diverse. And I feel like we don't really have that in Throne. It's mostly just a puddle of mid-rangey, control-ish grinding, mostly tri-faction good stuff decks, or two-faction, which mostly has been Praxis, because a lot of the powerful good stuff is in Praxis, so you can just go straight ramp Praxis and still keep up with a lot of the other good stuff decks. Which brings us to the next card. We have Heart of the Vault. That's a very interesting change. I think it's great that they changed the card. I think the card was way too good for way too long. Like, compare this to Rizan. Rizan is still very good. Sees quite a lot of play in the right decks. Especially Winchester is the deck that wants him. But even if you play like an X-Toon deck in a similar style, Rizan usually makes it. And Rizan is a 5/4 that deals 3, has conditional lifesteal, and has the downside of being reckless to balance the fact that it is flying. Heart of the Vault is a 6/6. Doesn't have any downside like reckless. Sure, it doesn't have evasion, but as one of the biggest units in play, evasion is also less relevant. The summon only deals 2, but in addition you get a free card, you get 2 of your power back, which arguably is even better than getting 2 of your power back, because you might draw a cheap interaction that you can play right away, a cheap drop that you can play right away. Or you draw a big drop like a Kairos that you can play the next turn for 7 instead of 9, which was absolutely bonkers. And on top of that, it has Warp. So in the best scenario, Heart of the Vault was a hard 4/1 in one card. And not like a 4/1 that's like play 1 card, draw 4 cards, which is fine because that costs a lot of tempo. It's a 4/1 that generates tempo and has massive board impact. Like, you get the 6/6 body, you get it for free if you warp it, you get the card back, and then you kill something with the deal 2 damage. And then of course you get some additional, then you get tempo from killing the thing in play that you killed, and you gain board impact from dropping a big body that stabilizes the board, and then you gain the 2 cost reduction on the card you draw. Changing it to 7 doesn't change any of that. It just puts it in a different spot in the curve, which is something that I'm not that happy with. Sure, it makes the card much more awkward to play in a lot of decks. Like, if you look at the Zulta deck, that doesn't work anymore now. You have Hard, Icaria, and Zulta Arcanum on 7. That really just doesn't work, and you don't have anything on 6 anymore. So that is gone, I think. Then we have Yennev. In Yennev, this is actually not a big problem. Yennev used to run 8/6s a lot of the time with Peak and Heart, and now you just have Peak on 6 and Heart on 7, so you can, like, it's a bit worse in the sense that you would prefer it the other way around. Normally you want to, like, Heart on 6 and then Peak on 7 and immediately copy Heart. Now you have to have a more stable board, which is also a bit harder with Aurelian Merchant weaker. Drop Peak, probably like shoot something for 5. Or if the board is very stable, gain power to ensure you have the 7th power for your Heart, which is nice. So Peak now enables, makes Heart on 7 more consistent. And then on 7 you play Heart, and on 8 you get to copy Heart if Heart and Peak are still around. So that also nerfs that sort of sequencing a bunch, which is sorry about that. Which is pretty nice. Then if you look at Praxis, one of the reasons I don't like this change as much is because it puts Praxis now in a really bad spot. Praxis doesn't have a 6-drop anymore, with Carnosaur also being 7 for a long time. I wouldn't have minded actually for Carnosaur to be reverted to a 6/6 for 6, since with the current power level, Carnosaur is totally fine and actually would be kind of like a welcome and more fair 6-drop in this modern world. Also would help balance the Rizan Icaria thing a bit and provide counterplay there for time decks, because I would imagine Winchest benefiting a lot from these changes and getting back in style. I'll get to that in a moment. And yeah, then if we look at Praxis, now Praxis doesn't really have a 6, and in Praxis Ramp you suddenly have 8/7s, which is really weird, because I think the best Praxis Ramp version is the one that I played a while ago with Ravid on 7, because Ravid provides great stabilization, another reasonably big body for Kairos to draw cards. It's also ramp, and ramp that doesn't die to a sweeper, so if they kill your Ravid, you still ramp to 9 to get, and it jumps from 7 to 9 for your Kairos. And now you suddenly have nothing on 6 and 8/7 drops, which is really problematic for a deck that is already kind of playing from behind and trying to ramp to a point where it can catch back up. Sure, the deck plays out in a way with the ramps sometimes that you go from 5 power to 7 power, so it's not that big of a deal in these scenarios, but it's too big of a deal on average that I don't think this is going to work. So maybe Praxis will have to go back to more of a Praxis mid-range style deck, topping out at Heart of the Vault, no Ravid, no Kairos, just Praxis mid-range, and see what it does with its 6-cost slot there maybe. If it can remain relevant. My guess would be that it might just not be relevant for a while. Actually, I think the change that I would have liked to see is leave it at 6, because I think the role that it fills is fairly unique and fairly important, since there aren't real alternatives in 6. And just pull noticeably back on its power and its value, because I think the card is just, even as a 7, so absurd in terms of what it does. Like, even as a 7-drop, this is arguably more powerful and definitely more value than Icaria, which is just ridiculous. So I would have, I could have imagined seeing just removing the draw a card part. So it's just deal 2 damage, 6-cost 6/6 warp that is still very powerful, which would put it more in line with Rizan, making it more on a similar power level as Rizan, and keep the cost reduction of 2. Just reduce the cost of the top card of your deck by 2. Probably in a way that it's literally top card, not top non-power card, so that it doesn't get passed down. But I think the way cost reduction works actually is that it automatically gets passed down even through 0-cost cards. Like if there is a power, a 0-cost card, a power, and then a 3-cost card, the 3-cost card gets reduced normally automatically the way cost reduction top of deck works. It just ignores anything that it can't reduce further. But yeah, even then it might have been fine. So you still kind of maintain some of the value and the core role and the core play pattern, but you pull back on the absurd 4-for-1 potential and grind value, and make it less appealing for these tri-faction decks to go out of their way to include it. And if they do, they don't get as much out of it. Like, I mean, it's still strong and it would have still probably remained in these decks, but for example, Zoltar might have considered to play Rizan over Heart, because now Rizan and Heart would be pretty close to each other, and it would be an interesting consideration which one you like more and which one adds more to your deck. So I guess in that sense Zoltar is fine, because it can now just play Rizan because Heart is gone as an option for it. We'll see how that works out, so that might retain some functionality there. But yeah, I don't like that core Praxis color decks seem to not really have a functional 6-drop anymore, which means Winchest, which has been very solid still and hasn't been affected by this at all, other than Torch now being not fast, which is fine. will come back, I think, and might become the again the premier 3-faction mid-range deck. Maybe Yennefer has a bit of a resurgence as well, since the Heart of the Vault change kind of slots in there, just kind of naturally, like I explained, and might not actually matter too much to the deck. We'll see how that pans out. And last but not least, we have the change to Desecrate. That's the change I am least happy with. I'm a bit surprised by this, because I feel like the problem in Eternal right now are these, especially tri-faction, play the best threats, play the best answers type decks. Desecrate did not play a role in these decks. Double Shadow made it too hard to cast early on, where you need your removal in these decks, like Winchest, for example, can't support Desecrate. The deck is basically Rakano with a secondary Shadow, either for like single cost removal type stuff, or sometimes for like double Shadow or drop in the form of Vara, but not capable of reliably supporting double Shadow on turn 2 or 3, where you need your removal to not fall behind. And also, taking 3 damage in a deck that plays from behind is a really big deal. So this card mostly saw play in proactive mid-range decks like Stonescar midrange, and in decks that were more reactive, that it occasionally saw play, like I don't know, Felon decks and stuff like that. Losing 3 pulse, taking 3 damage, was a huge cost against a lot of decks, especially against proactive and aggressive decks that are kind of struggling these days. So I felt like the card was pretty well balanced between the double influence and the 3 damage to be more of a tool for 2-faction proactive or even aggressive decks, and very unappealing for these sort of predominant good stuff decks. And I feel like this is gonna hurt proactive potential a fair share. Like, look at Stonescar midrange. Stonescar midrange has been in a pretty rough spot for a while, and pretty underwhelming. I tried it a bunch because I really like the deck, and if it's good, it's the kind of playstyle I enjoy, and that gives you the sort of proactive advantage without a lot of the potential downsides of a true aggressive deck and its fragility in a fairly hostile environment like Eternal. And Desecrate was very important for that deck and to its success when it was good, and wasn't even enough to keep it like a top deck currently. And changing Desecrate hurts it further and makes it even harder for these types of decks to come back, which is something that I feel like is not ideal, because if you ask me, we are missing more lower curve proactive midrange like Stonescar and similar things, and especially true aggro. Like, true aggro in Throne is in a rough spot for a long time. Like, if you look at tournaments and top tier competitive stuff, aggro hasn't been doing well for, I don't know, more than a year, maybe almost 2 years, I would argue. Like, hardly anyone thinks aggro is a realistic, even like a realistic consideration for Throne tournaments, ECQs type stuff. It's pretty rough. Like, I guess the last time aggro did sort of well was when N. Rausch played his 7 Merchant Skycrack aggro to I think top 4 ECQ finish or top 2. And even that was more like a one-man success than a wide consideration and wide playability. So it's more of like this underdog niche success than aggro being like widely viable and good. And I don't think like aggro should be the best deck or anything, but I think it, like, one of the top decks, one of the tier 1 decks, at least occasionally, should be a real aggro deck, so that the other tier 1 decks have this counterplay with each other. If we have like a tier 1 control deck, a tier 1 mid-range deck, and a tier 1 aggro deck, they all kind of like balance each other a bit and keep this macro balancing going, which I feel like we often don't have in the same way in Throne. So yeah, Desecrate now costs 3 and is fast. The fact that it's now fast is definitely nice, although it's a bit weird since the fast aspect matters more in reactive decks, where being double shadow and costing 3 health while also costing 3 power makes this really awkward, and in proactive decks the fast effect isn't that relevant, and the 3 cost now makes it really clunky. Interestingly enough though, that's another efficient, fairly universal removal spell that has gone from 2 to 3, so with Vanquish. So this will likely make units a bit better, especially like medium-sized sort of non-value units, stuff like Titan and Vara and all that sort of stuff, units that feel pretty bad if you pay like 4 power on them and then the opponent just answers them for 2 and gets ahead on you. And now the commitment to answer these is a lot bigger. We see that in Magic these days, a fair share of removal that is good and universal and kind of unconditional costs 3 to open up space for good units, good creatures to shine, and we'll see if that has a similar effect here and if that is a good thing. One thing that I still feel like is quite problematic is how good and omnipresent, especially Show, but also Hurler is. Hurler to a lesser extent, because Ixtun in that style isn't really a thing right now. Yennefer isn't that big of a thing, and it's the only sort of deck that can play Show and Hurler. But Show is in every single of these Tri-Faction fire decks. It's in Winchest, it's in Zoltar, it's in Yennefer, it's in Ixtun. It's just too good at what it does. It's a free 2-for-1, it smoothes out your early draws, it still provides an impactful must-answer late-game bomb in the games that go long and where it's grindy, so the nerf to that part didn't really matter too much, and in the matchups where things play out differently, you just stuff it away anyway, and if the game goes to like turn 1,000,000, it doesn't matter whether it costs 7, 8, or 9, sure, as 7, it was even more absurd because it was better in games where it shouldn't be good. Now it's only relevant in scenarios and games where cost doesn't really matter much anymore and you just want to have more stuff to slam into your opponent's removal. But yeah, these free 2-for-1s in particular Show, but also to an extent Hurler, because Hurler is arguably even better than Show when it's good. It's just less viable because it's primal, and primal struggles, which also, by the way, contributes to the problems of go to the ground aggro, because the free snowball from Hurler is so good, and the body of Hurler doesn't matter, because if snowball, like in the grindy matchups, where a snowball and the body are not that great, you have 8 merchants and strategize to turn them into real cards. And in a lot of other cases, the snowball will be relevant, and you don't have as much time to durdle, or the game doesn't go as long to draw that many strategizes and merchants, so you only need to get rid of the body and turn it into a real card with strategize or merchant. And yeah, getting to run like this free roll, 1 cost, deal 1 that kills a lot of the early aggressive units, especially punishing to all the 1-drops, and also deals with like Aegis, which is supposedly a good tool against these decks, and forces them to go out of their way to deal with it. Now it just kind of becomes a minor nuisance rather than an actual problem that might cost you 2 cards to deal with it, or force you to stick a unit to block, or have a relic weapon to attack it that way. So yeah, I Don't know honestly how I would change them, because the inherent problem is actually the fate itself, that you get 2 cards for 1 for 0 power in a game, in a world where we have various ways of turning any random card, no matter how bad, into a real card, be it Strategize, be it Honor of Claws, and these like 8 merchant smuggler setups that we have, to name the most prominent options there. So yeah, even if, I don't know, Hurler would be an 0-1 and would give you a snowball, it would be almost as good as it is now, and it would still see a lot of play. It would just be a little less great, but not bad enough that people wouldn't play it. But like, that's the thing. If you if you can make changes to a card and it would still see almost as much play as it does right now, it's probably too good. Sure, you could argue it sees almost as much play because there's now a card that can fill the role, but even that feeds into maybe the role is too good, too impactful to exist in the way it does, and so on. So yeah, and I think there's a lot of changes you could do to show or Hurler, and the cards would see almost exactly as much play as they do right now. And yeah, they are kind of the crux to me of these dry faction good stuff decks that have been so dominant in Eternal for so long. Heart of the Vault, by the way, was another case. There's so many things you could have changed and tweaked on the card, and it'd still be like absurdly good. So yeah. All right, that was a pretty long one. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the changes and my thoughts on them. And of course, you get all your dust back for the copies you crafted for a while, and you get 1,250 gold for the Desecrate change if you bought the campaign. So yeah, that's my take on the changes. Looking forward to figuring out the throne format leading up to the next ECQ. And let me know in the comments what you think. Yeah, that's it again for this time. I'm your host, ManuS. Thank you for watching. Bye.